All right, welcome back from part 3 of First Corinthians. Now, this time we're going to talk about chapters 8 through 11. And Paul is addressing a third issue at the Corinthian church. Remember, I told you 2 videos ago that when I was growing up, I kind of thought of First Corinthians as having all these different topics of conversation. But really, if you step back and look at it, you'll see that Paul's just addressing about 5 separate things. And so this is the third thing he's addressing. And in chapter 8, he acknowledges that some of the people in Corinth are more mature believers are eating meat sacrificed to an idol. And he says, we know that an idol is really nothing, that there isn't actually there's no power in an idol. And he says it's just meat. And he says, but not everybody who's come to faith has that understanding yet. There are some people in the Corinthian region who have come to faith in Christ who still place value maybe on an idol, or maybe they've just become brand new believers and they don't understand the value of those things. And so Paul is saying, look, we know, we who are mature know that an idol is nothing, and eating meat sacrificed to an idol isn't a big deal. But not everybody understands that. Not everybody knows that. So in chapter 9, he starts talking about some of his rights that he has laid down for the sake of the gospel. So he acknowledges to them in chapter 8, you have the right to eat meat sacrificed to an idol, but it's not always the best thing to do to take advantage of the rights you have. So in chapter 9, he gives 2 examples of rights that he laid down for the sake of the gospel. One was he laid down the right of taking along a believing wife like Peter and the other apostles did. And then he also laid down the right of demanding payment for the preaching in the Corinthian church. So he could have said to the Corinthian church, you need to pay me for preaching the gospel among you. And certainly Paul took money from other churches, but he didn't from Corinth. And the only reason given for that is that there would have been something in Paul taking money from the Corinthian church that would have hindered the gospel in Corinth. And so this is where we see that he was working and building tents with his friends, Priscilla and Aquila. And so Paul is coming to them and he's going, look, I laid down my rights for the sake of the gospel. He says, I became all things to all people so that I might win some. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those who were not under the law, I acted like I wasn't under the law for the sake of the gospel. And so that's a text that gets thrown around a lot. You know, I became all things to all people that I might win some, or that I might save some. And we forget that there is a context in which Paul said that. So he is reminding the Corinthian church, like, you have freedom in Christ to eat meat sacrificed to an idol, but if it's compromising the gospel, then you abstain from that. You lay down your right, because what matters most is that the people around you come to understand who Christ is. He goes on to say at the end of 1 Corinthians 9, he says that, he goes, don't you know that all runners in a race run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way as to receive the prize. I don't run without aim. I discipline my body. I make it my slave. I don't box the air. And so he's talking verses that I got to tell you, when I was a sophomore in high school, I was a swimmer for a couple of years in high school, and I joined FCA as part of our community there, and it was a wonderful thing to be a part of. But it turns out like FCA groups really like to preach that text, 1 Corinthians 9, because it says, don't all runners in a race run, but only one receives the prize. And then talks about boxing, so they kind of borrow it and go, look, it's athleticism, yes. But that's not what Paul's making. The point isn't about Paul being athletic. The point is about self-discipline. And he's saying, lay down your rights, be self-disciplined enough to lay down your rights for the sake of the gospel. I strongly encourage you, if you're not listening to our Simpler podcast, that you check out the episode coming up in the middle of May that deals with this topic. And so the idea, the motivating factor behind us, as Paul is saying, behind the Christian heart, the motivating factor is the gospel, not whether or not I have the freedom to eat meat sacrificed to an idol. Then from chapter 9, he immediately goes into chapter 10 and he says, look at the cravings of the people who wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Look at how they desired food and they died. This is when the people were in the wilderness and God gave them meat the first time. He gave them quail, and he was so upset with them for putting him to the test that even as they're eating the quail that they've cooked, they begin to die while it's still between their teeth. And it talks about their sexual sin, the appetite of sex that they had at the sin of Peor. And where would that be? Yeah, Numbers 25. Sorry, blanked for a second there. But he's talking about these things, these appetites that these people had. And he goes, look at the lessons from them. Don't be driven by your appetites. Lay your rights down, lay your appetites down for the sake of the gospel. And then one of our favorite verses to quote, of course, is 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And we leave off the next two verses, which go on to say, giving no offense to the Jew or the Gentile or to the church of God, not seeking after my own advantage, but seeking after the Lord so that they may be saved, so that people may know the gospel, in other words. And so Paul is addressing the problem. He addresses the problem in chapter 8, and that is people are using their freedoms that they have in Christ as they're using their liberty with no concern for how it impacts the gospel around them. One of the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 that's super interesting is he says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. And what's super interesting in the context of that is Paul is not speaking about benefit to himself when he says not everything is beneficial. He's saying everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial to the body. I'm looking to do the thing that builds up the body. I'm looking to do the thing that equips the body. I'm looking to do the thing that equips the saints so that they'll know the gospel. And this is the motivating factor behind Paul's decision. So again, we see this model here where Paul presents the problem in chapter 8, and he's correcting their thinking in chapters 9 and 10. And then in chapter 11, he's going to talk to them a little bit about how to behave. He's saying you're partaking, at the end of 10, you're partaking in the table of the Lord's, the table of demons and the table of the Lord. And then at the end of chapter 11, he's going to talk about the Lord's Supper and how to take the Lord's Supper in a worthy manner, in a way that proclaims God, in a way that proclaims Christ's death until he comes. And so, again, here, this section, 4 chapters, 8, 9, 10, and 11 of 1 Corinthians, is addressing a singular issue, one issue. And that is that these people are eating meat sacrificed to idols. They're taking advantage of the freedom they have in Christ with no regard for how they're representing the body or the gospel to the rest of the body. And Paul is addressing that. And he's saying, look, so all these verses that we love, where I love 1 Corinthians 9:16, where Paul says, woe is me, if I do not preach the gospel of Christ. I am compelled to preach the gospel. And I love that verse. Many years ago, I kind of adopted it as one of my own verses just for the thrust of being a preacher who is compelled to preach the gospel. But Paul's not just randomly talking about the importance of preaching the gospel there. He's talking about laying down our rights and disciplining our bodies so that what we are preaching by our actions, what we're preaching by the way we live, is the gospel of Christ. And so this is what Paul wants us to be proclaiming through our lives. And so look at these 4 chapters, look at how Paul is talking about laying down rights for the benefit of the body, and then have a discussion. See how that might shape you as a follower of Christ to live according to the gospel, and see if it won't benefit the body of Jesus. Tune in next week as we talk about part 4 from 1 Corinthians. Have a good day.